You are on.
All right. All right, guys, I'm going to do a little survey right now because I don't know how much this topic is actually talked about. So please raise your hand if on one of the walks that you shadowed, the docent talked about marine protected areas. Okay.
But so when talked about, you mean more than mentioned?
Follow-up question. How long did they talk about marine protected areas? It's not a focus of it.
A minute or so, basically to explain that it's part of the park. It's more than just the terrestrial piece.
Okay. So today what I'm hoping to do is to provide you with more of that back pocket knowledge on marine protected areas for people to ask questions about them, but also try to give you direct links between marine protected areas and the wildlife that we have here. So why is it benefiting the wildlife that we have here? Particularly the elephant seals, which is kind of a hard connection to make because they're not feeding while they're here at Año Nuevo. So, what is a marine protected area? It's a place that's designated to help protect and restore marine life and the habitat in the ocean. And these are mainly in California, coastal. There are larger marine protected areas that I'll talk about that span further offshore. Around the globe, only 1.8% of the ocean is designated as a no-take marine protected area, where the marine life is protected from the pressures of human activity, like fishing, in the sense of recreational and commercial, or collecting in any other sense. So thinking about how much land we have preserved in the United States alone, only 1% or 1.8% of the ocean is very little. And it's hard to protect the ocean in the sense that it's spanning very vast parts of our planet, and you just can't regulate something that big. So what we try to do is protect our coastal areas that are closest to us that we likely have the highest impact on. So giving you a sense of our California marine protected areas, in our coastal waters, it's protecting a lot of wildlife. So this is an illustration that Fish and Wildlife created, where you're seeing it's not just our kelp forests, but it's going and spanning into the Elkhorn Slough specifically. So it's protecting a lot of different types of habitats that not just marine mammals, but invertebrates, birds, fish species, all inhabit. So it's protecting these guys at multiple levels of the food chain. So a little bit of background of how marine protected areas, at least in California, came to be. In 1999, the Marine Life Protection Act was passed. This act directed the state to redesign the current marine protected areas or reserves that we already had, to turn it into more of a cohesive and effective network, so that we're not just protecting certain little pieces of the coastline, but the whole coastline together. This whole process of forming this network took a number of years. So it wasn't until 2012 that this network came to be. And the whole process of creating those regulations, the types of marine protected areas, was a very collaborative process. It wasn't just our state government making those decisions. It was the people fishing in those environments, that their livelihood depended on those environments. It was tribal and government representatives, educators and researchers that taught people about those environments, that collected data to better understand those environments, and also conservationists that wanted to preserve those areas. So this idea of having this network throughout California and having this be a collaborative process that's not just benefiting one individual person, it's benefiting everybody that visits the coast for many different types of activities. And our marine protected area network is essentially enforced and regulated by the Department of Fish and Wildlife. So if you see somebody in a marine protected area doing something that they're not supposed to be doing, California Fish and Wildlife are going to be the people responding to enforce those regulations. Any questions so far? Why are these important? Why did we decide that we needed to protect our marine environment? So these protections are promoting biodiversity and abundance of marine life, depending on what regulations are in place in certain areas, and I'll talk about the different types of marine protected areas. But it's increasing the number of fish. We're reducing the amount of fishing pressure on those animals. Those animals can increase in the number, but also the size of the individuals, because we're conserving some of those larger fish that may be hunted or targeted for commercial fishing. We're not just conserving the animal itself. It may be put in place with the idea of there are some very sensitive species in this area, but we're protecting the habitat and the whole food chain within that habitat, not just that one individual animal. It improves recreational, educational, and study opportunities, giving people the opportunity to talk about these protections, talk about how things have changed in a marine protected area versus a non-marine protected area, how wildlife is coming back because of those protections. And then these also protect special places for cultural, spiritual, and historic value. So bringing in that potential tribal element, historical element of areas that were very important to people historically. So in California, we have two different types of marine protected areas. We have marine protected areas at the federal level that are national marine sanctuaries, and we actually have 4 different national marine sanctuaries along our coastline. We have Channel Islands down in Southern California. We have Cordell Bank and the Gulf of the Farallones that are off of the San Francisco, Sonoma area. And then we have the Monterey Bay National Marine Sanctuary that butts right up against those and protects the coastline down into San Luis Obispo County. So we are protecting these areas not just at a federal level, which are these kind of really faint white lines that you'll see in the water here, but at the state level, which are those smaller multicolored segments of our coastline. So the state marine protected areas, we have a network of 124 up and down the California coast and on some of our islands. This is covering about 16% of all our coastal state waters. So we are covering a pretty significant amount of our coastline to protect animals and their habitats. And by having this as a network, you then have this connection between potentially different marine protected areas of fish spilling off into the surrounding environment outside of that marine protected area. Those can then be fished by recreation or commercial fishermen. That's supporting that kind of off-flow environment. And that in turn promotes throughout the whole state this really healthy whole ecosystem. So rather than just having a couple up and down the state that really can't have an impact over a large swath with the level of, or with the amount of space that a fish can disperse their offspring through, then impact the next little section of coastline. So this is the wordiest slide. I promise they're not all this intense, but there are a lot of different types of marine protected areas. So under that state level, we have state marine reserves, which do not allow any type of extractive or damaging activity, which is take. So people can't take fish, invertebrates, except for those working under a scientific collection permit. So if you do want to take from one of these areas, you do need to have the proper permitting to do so. State marine parks do not allow commercial take, but they do allow types of recreational take to be allowed. And that will be specified depending on the species, depending on the size of animals within that species, or on the age, potentially. State marine conservation areas, where take, damage, injury, or possession of marine resources, living, geological, or cultural, is prohibited, except for species expressly allowed for recreational and commercial take. So a lot of these marine protected areas have very specific regulations dependent on the place that you're going to. So you might be allowed to take one fish species in one marine protected area, but you go to a different marine protected area and you can't take that fish species. So it's really important to know what you're allowed to do if you're going to a marine protected area with the express purpose of collecting resources from that area. If you're going for recreation or education, free for all, more than welcome to do those in almost every area. State marine recreational management areas, which restrict the take of living marine resources, but allow some recreational hunting in those areas. And then special closures, where there's a localized protection of seabirds, nesting, rookery sites, and marine mammal haul-out sites. So within a marine protected area, there might be a specific special closure on a certain section with the express purpose of maybe seasonally protecting that area from human disturbance during a really important time for seabirds, marine mammals, or other breeding species. So you will see that potentially at different areas. Most of the special closures I've found have been in Southern California. So if we're looking at Central California, marine protected areas are broken up into 5 different regions. We're the Central California region, and we're kind of right at the top here at Año Nuevo. So the Central California region is between Pigeon Point and Point Conception. This includes 29 marine protected areas, 13 of which are marine reserves, which is what Año Nuevo is. 14 are marine conservation areas. 1 is a marine park, and 1 is a state marine recreational management area. 18% of the state waters in this region are protected by marine protected areas, which is pretty awesome. 7.5% being no-take state marine reserves, where you are welcome to come and recreate and learn and explore those areas without the potential impact of removal of species that could impact that food web.
Maybe you're going to get to this, but are the marine reserves basically placed in areas that have the greatest density of wildlife? Is that the idea?
Yeah, so dependent on the goals of those multiple groups of people, when they're making an informed decision of, you know, this area is really important for maybe this one species, it might start off that way, and then bringing all these different groups in to say, you know, this is really important to protect this species so that it repopulates this area where they historically were. So this marine protected area network can still grow. So it's not done and final at 124. There are still groups trying to enact new marine protected areas dependent on how species or habitats are being impacted. And I can't remember, Susan, do you know if there's people advocating for another marine sanctuary, right? National Marine Sanctuary in California?
I've heard that, yeah.
Okay.
I don't know where it is though. Where that
I
one
want
is
to say it
Southern
was
California?
I want to say it was San Luis Obispo County, if I'm remembering correctly. So,
Takes a lot of studies to figure that out.
yeah, through the collaborations of researchers really understanding that environment, fishermen really understanding, you know, how are the fish populations doing based on what we catch in those areas, bringing those, essentially the people on the ground are probably more likely to be the ones to take it up to the federal or state level, of saying, hey, you know, we need to protect this species or this resource or this habitat. So if you look at a lot of these places, granted, many of them are in an area where there's a state park. People already know those state parks very well. Knowing the resources that are in that state park probably led to the development of a state marine reserve or conservation area in those areas. So Año Nuevo, we have so many different large marine predators at Año Nuevo. So many seabirds using Año Nuevo and then just south of us Greyhound Rock during different times of the year. So many invertebrate and fish species that are using these areas that are that may have varying levels of recovery from overfishing in the past. So Año Nuevo Greyhound Rock is the two in our area, but you also see Natural Bridges and Elkhorn Slough and Carmel Bay and Point Lobos. Many of these areas already had some level of protection too, and being known for a very important habitat for sea otters, an endangered species. Yeah.
So just a question about the size of the zone. It looks like
Yeah.
that boundary is pretty consistent. So how far offshore does it go, thinking about this no-take regulation?
I will get into that.
Okay, sorry about that.
No. I will get into that with the next slide, but I think it's all dependent on what the goals of that study are. During that process of deciding how much coastline to protect, how far offshore to protect, is dependent on probably how much movement do those species have. And you don't want a marine protected area that's too small, because it's not going to make a significant impact on those fish or those invertebrates or marine mammals. But also making one that's too big, it's kind of a sweet spot with these for understanding how those recruitment for fish and invertebrate populations, how far do currents take those animals? So knowing how big to make that, so we know, you know, fish or animals born at Piedras Blancas, are they going to move potentially up to Bay Creek? Are they going to move down to Morro Bay? Do they have the capability of moving that far? Or do we need to put a marine protected area in between there to make it effective overall for that ecosystem to stay healthy?
If I can see that map wasn't correct, so the right one is state marine reserve is under the
Yes.
state marine conservation area, and I see that in a few locations.
Sorry.
I can do loud. In a few locations they are
Yeah.
adjacent, like
Yeah.
in the point, like I have at Big Creek and Piedras Blancas. Is that a typical one, or like what is the point of having them adjacent to each other?
That's a really great question. I don't have the direct answer for it, but I'm going to try to give you my best answer. The State Marine Reserve, how they classify that is there's no take allowed close to shore. But as you move offshore, you're seeing that those conservation areas provide some form of take. So that might be that they want heavier regulations on protection in those nearshore environments to then spill off a little further offshore, where they're allowing fishermen to still fish in that area, but they want to keep a certain section of that on the coastline protected fully. Whereas just off of there, where maybe those fish species are recruiting in another section of that habitat, then they can take them just outside of that state reserve.
Got it.
is my best guess, but I can get a better answer for that.
Thank you.
Seems like it would be sort of a fuzzy boundary for commercial fisher people. I read stories all the time in the news about marine animals being harmed by fishermen and fishermen being upset about this salmon spawning and so forth. And I'm looking at this map and it's all very clearly defined. And I'm thinking, well, how would Fish and Wildlife enforce that?
Yeah, it's a great question. And it's similar to the, you know, how does Ziad as a ranger
Yeah.
enforce everything that happens in the
Right,
state park? So very similarly, where they get reports from different groups of people, whether that be the general public out on a boat and they know the regulations and they call it in, to Fish and Wildlife, who then follows up on that report. I'm not quite sure, dependent on what people decide to do, if they're kind of skirting the boundary of the rules, what the levels of fines are for those specific taking of species in a marine reserve. I can look that up, but I think it's a pretty similar process to the rangers here, where, you know, they get tips. Also, you know, fishermen self-checking each other, because they don't all want that opportunity to fish in that area or to collaborate well with Fish and Wildlife to go away. That happens pretty often in the whale watching industry in Monterey Bay, where the whale watching industries kind of self-regulate each other. You know, if you see a boat being really persistent in following animals for a really long period of time that are obviously wanting to have their own space, but other boats checking that individual company helps keep it as still a resource and an opportunity for all the other companies in the bay. So one person causing a lot of problems can cause a lot of problems for the whole group of people. So that might play into that regulation process, but at least here in California, all fishermen know these rules, and they're using their maps while they're out fishing. So they have GPS data for where they can and can't go. So they have it, it's at their fingertips, it's at their disposal. And they're utilizing all those resources to figure out where they want to go that day for either recreational fishing or commercial fishing. So I find often in the fishing industry, yeah, it can be like a kind of check yourself, or just people reporting a lot.
Are commercial fishermen, are they tracked by GPS? Are they required to put a transponder on their boat or anything like
Good question. I'm not sure if all commercial fishermen have to do that, but there are definitely,
that? Part of their permitting?
trying to remember what it's called. Similar to like planes, helicopters, up in the sky. You could track those through apps on your phone. It's also a thing in the ocean too. So if they have those capabilities on their boat, yes, Fish and Wildlife could definitely track them and track their potential movements.
I was just
But I don't know
gonna
if it's required.
yes to that, and there are nonprofit organizations that track all the commercial fishing
Yeah.
vessels worldwide. And if they turn off their tracking devices, they have ways of using machine learning to identify where they probably are, and then they report it. But there are a couple of very active nonprofits that do it all across the Pacific Ocean.
Very interesting. So nonprofits, part of the
Yes,
enforcement.
nonprofit organizations are on top of this.
Additionally, Fish and Wildlife does hire observers to go out on commercial and recreational boats, and also sit at harbor mouths to either measure the fish that come in or then check people on, hey, you're not supposed to have that species of fish on your boat. So they do have people out and about that aren't specifically law enforcement, but then can report them to law enforcement based on what they catch the size of their catch if it's within regulations. And for those that actually go out on the longer boat trips with commercial fishermen, they can see the amount of potential bycatch of the species that they weren't directly trying to catch, and record all of that over time to see what kind of impact they're having on the environment based on what types of fishing tools they're using. So yeah, many different ways of keeping track of that.
Are there accounts of where the MPAs have had adverse consequences? And I know, at least in the past, and I don't know if this is still true, there was a narrative that protecting the elephant seals increased the great white population, which increased the inadvertent bites on sea otters, which actually increased the number of abalones, and you can go take it both upstream and downstream from there. So
Yeah.
is that still a thing, or?
Good question. I don't have a specific account of that.
And I know
More
for at
just
least a
accounts
while, the sea otter population was declining.
In our area.
Where are the elephant seals
Where-
protected?
Gotcha. I'm not sure of any other types of accounts like that currently. I could look into that for sure. Most of at least the educational material that's shared for marine protected areas is talking more about, this species that was highly endangered is being protected by this marine protected area, and we're seeing an increase in that species population. But as we all know, one species is not the only thing to focus on in the environment. Everybody is connected in so many different ways. So yeah, an abalone population shooting off is going to have an impact on their predators and their prey. And the interactions their predators and prey have with other species is going to have an effect there too. Great question. I will look into that one further. So within our Central California waters for this region, we have so many different species that either live here year-round or migrate through the area. So 26 different species of marine mammals that are either resident to the area or that travel through those Central California waters. 94 species of seabirds, which is crazy to think about. I don't think I ever see 94 species of seabirds when I go out in the bay. 4 different species of sea turtles that could occur. Most often we're only seeing one primarily here in Monterey Bay, which is the leatherback sea turtle. But their ranges of potentially green, loggerhead, and I think hawksbill have range up into Central California. 345 species of fish. Our kelp forests promote so much fish biodiversity. And the number of different types of environments. We have rocky reefs, we have sandy habitats, we have deep sea habitats, and kelp forest habitats. And then the immense plethora of marine invertebrates, probably too many to count, and they probably haven't documented all of the different invertebrate species that live here in Central California. Some of which could be our fun and very exciting little nudibranch species that we can see tide pooling. This is the Hopkins rose. To all of the great amount of biodiversity under the mud substrate within the Elkhorn Slough that promotes so much food for seabirds, shorebirds, sea otters. And then 450 plus species of marine algae. And there's probably still the potential that we haven't documented every single species of algae out there too. So Central California is such a productive and rich biodiverse ecosystem to provide protections for, so that we keep our coastal waters healthy and productive. The benefit of having fishermen in this conversation is so that we can keep the environment healthy enough so they still have fish to fish in the future. It's not just that we want to keep everything at a no-take everywhere. People still need to have their livelihoods protected, and this helps that. So some of our species that are benefiting from marine protected areas, we have the black abalone. Over the years, black abalone have experienced significant declines in abundance due to overfishing and disease in the area. That disease being something called withering syndrome. But there's been increases in the size of those abalone within marine protected areas, suggesting an increased compliance with marine protected areas and the effectiveness of marine protected area enforcement. So making sure that that abalone species has the potential to grow to a healthy size, to then promote continual growth of their population in a marine protected area, and then when those mollusks disperse out in their pelagic form, they can then promote abundance in those surrounding areas outside of the marine protected area. We have our lingcod. Based on monitoring, lingcod have shown a general increase in both size in and outside of marine protected areas from 2007 to 2011. So this is likely the impact of those earlier marine protected areas that were already in effect before the network was fully established. Rockfish of so many different species, and these are fish that are often caught recreationally by a lot of people. There are 65 species of rockfish off of the Pacific coast. Many of those rockfish can live for hundreds of years. These are long-lived fish. The rough-eyed rockfish, which I have pictured here, are the longest known living fish on Earth and can live for over 200 years.
Wow.
Based on 5-year baseline monitoring from 2007 to 2012, 7 of the 10 species of rockfish studied at Año Nuevo, Point Lobos, Piedras Blancas, and Point Fuchin were found to be larger in size inside the marine protected area than out. So these extremely long-lived fish are being able to live to those older ages within marine protected areas without that fishing pressure. And a fish that's 200 years old is likely producing a lot more young than a 10-year-old fish that's smaller. So really the size of a fish has a really large impact on how much reproductive output they have and how much impact they have on the regeneration of their population. So it's really important that we don't just protect one size of fish, but all sizes of fish. To have fish over multiple generations, but protecting these large ones is also really important. A talk that I heard from the Omnibus and Travel Band last week talked about how they interacted with the marine environment and how they fished. And what he said was, we didn't take just one type or one size. You wanted to make sure there was fish of every size left in the environment after you were hunting. So they understood the importance of that very early on in just their observational process of knowing how the environment worked. Rather than just hunting until you don't find anymore. Our northern elephant seals, we don't totally know the direct obvious effects of marine protected areas on northern elephant seals, but many of their breeding habitat coastlines are within marine protected areas. That could potentially have benefits on those weanlings that spend more time in the water, just off of the beach spaces where they were born. As we all know, our favorited marine weasel are southern sea otters here in California. Within central California coast, the sea otters prefer that shallow water coastal kelp forest habitat. They help anchor, that helps anchor them while they rest. They're feeding on the huge biodiversity of wildlife within those kelp forests. So protecting the habitat that sea otters are within and protecting the species that they specifically feed on is super important to their recovery. Our southern sea otters are still on the endangered species list. They keep kind of bouncing up and down their threshold for being taken off the endangered species list. So they still have a little ways to go before they reach a population level where they can be delisted.
Emma?
Yeah.
Are you going to talk about the starfish wasting disease and the effect on the kelp forest?
I can. Yeah.
And that directly affects the recovery of the sea otters.
Yeah. So for those who are not as familiar with the level of impact that sea otters and sea urchin eating predators have on kelp forest environments, when you remove those top predators like sea otters, California sheephead, and sunflower stars specifically, which are a large starfish that will range up into Washington waters as well, it has a dramatic effect on the environment and the biodiversity of that environment. So taking out those predators essentially messes with the food web where you have your predator here, you have your sea urchins here, and then you have your kelp here. If you remove that top predator and the pressure controlling that urchin population becomes unchecked, and they can decimate a kelp forest very quickly and turn it into something called an urchin barren. That then dramatically decreases the level of biodiversity in that habitat. So the impact of sea otters, and specifically those sunflower stars, are very important. Something that occurred a number of years ago that we're still not back to recovery from was a wasting disease that was seen not just in sunflower stars but other sea star species. And sea stars of many different species are important for different habitats. So we have ochre stars, which are those big purple and orange ones that you see when you go tide pooling. They have a very dramatic impact on controlling mussel populations in that rocky intertidal zone. Removing those species through that disease that I don't know if I've still gotten a concrete answer on how that disease proliferated throughout the marine environment, but it essentially caused sea otters to get these white sores on their body and then just kind of start to fall apart.
The starfish, you mean?
Yeah, sorry.
Starfish.
Yeah. Yeah, so essentially removing those sea stars from the environment had a dramatic effect up and down the west coast of the United States. There are labs up in Washington, I know right now, that are trying to raise sunflower stars in captivity to a very large size to then put them back into the environment. Because through just the natural process of being out in the marine environment, little ones can get picked off and not grow fully to those large sizes that they need to protect the environment. Any questions about that? It's a complicated disease, from my understanding.
They think it's a virus that was
Yeah.
endemic in the starfish and the sunflower starfish, but the virus was somehow triggered or activated when the temperature of the ocean was elevated. So it's almost an intractable problem. If anybody goes tide pooling nowadays, you're not going to find any starfish. It's just dead.
You know, I am seeing quite a few now.
They're coming back.
They're
yeah.
coming back. So I think that the sunflower stars are having a harder time, but at least from what I've seen in the last few years in the ochre star population, I'm seeing a lot more of them than I did during that really intense period of that virus ripping through the population.
Now what happens? Do these sea urchins take over because the starfish are gone and then they ruin the kelp and the kelp is gone and then the otters are gone?
Yeah. But most often, if there's a sea otter in that environment, they're keeping it all in check. It's the removal of those predators that that really has a significant impact. And sea otters don't span the whole west coast of the United States. So those other predators like the sunflower star and the California sheephead in Southern California are the sea otters of their environment to help keep things in check. Yeah. Yeah.
I had a fourth grader from over here in Santa Cruz tell me that that was known as the keystone species.
Yeah.
And I had heard that since I was like in high school. I was like, yeah, very good.
Yeah. Yeah. So all of those different different species that I mentioned are very key to their environment, and if they're removed from that environment, there's a dramatic shift in how that environment operates. So they're key to keeping that environment healthy. Great, Kristen, thank you for bringing that up. That's something that people do still ask questions about.
Okay.
And then giant kelp, sorry. Last one on there. So, does anybody know how fast giant kelp can grow in a day? In like perfect conditions.
2 feet, 2 feet.
2 feet, yeah, 2 feet a day. When it's like really, when it's at its peak growth period with really significant sunlight. So this is a super important integral part to our coastline here in so many different ways. Kelp forests grow along our rocky coastlines in depths of about 6 feet to 90 feet of water. As we know, they host so many invertebrate fish and marine mammal and bird species that exist in those environments. And it's such an important resource and species for marine protected areas in particular to protect. I know that now people are looking at giant kelp and many algae species as a potential resource for us now. So we'll see how regulations on giant kelp harvesting goes in the next few decades, because we're looking at that as a very renewable resource because of how quickly it can grow compared to other resources that we harvest in the environment.
Did I hear you say as low as 6 or 60? What was it?
It's from 6 feet to 90 feet.
So 6.
Yeah, 6. So, we're looking at the marine protected area that we have here at Año Nuevo State Park. It covers 11.15 square miles, and it spans about roughly 8 miles of coastline. The depth that it covers within that marine protected area is from 0 to 175 feet. And that's encompassing our island habitat that we have off of Año Nuevo. So the composition of that habitat is rocky reef, sandy and muddy environments, and then we have other, which I'm not quite sure what they mean by that. Nobody gave a definition to the other category. But within that Año Nuevo State Marine Reserve, people are allowed to enter our reserve. This is a reserve where non-consumptive activities can occur, like people passing through on boats, people recreating offshore in the waters, people recreating on the coastal beaches here, like Cove Beach. So it's for that non-consumptive recreation and education and enjoyment of the public while they're out. And then we see that it does butt up against what I'll talk about next, which is our state marine conservation area, where they do allow different types of recreational take. So if we see anybody with fishing lines in the water off of this section of coastline, that's a big no-no. So often we'll occasionally see boats passing by or boats tucking into the cove just before the island, just for rest. But if you're seeing lines dropping in the water off those boats, letting people know that that's happening so that Fish and Wildlife can get called out to handle that situation. Yeah.
So are boaters allowed to circumnavigate the island?
I don't think so, and that might apply, and Susan can correct me on this if she knows, but I think that might apply more under the reserve part of Año Nuevo State Park and not the marine protected area regulations. So our Año Nuevo reserved for research purposes. I don't even know if people can safely get in and out of that area just based on how shallow it is.
Yeah.
They have, I've heard stories that people have kayaked through.
Yeah.
And it's okay. Just hard to do because there's not a lot of good spots to pull in and pull out and such. So there can be some of that recreation. Of course, it's, especially when a lot of seals in the water, to be able to maintain that 25-foot, or in some cases it's, you know, further distance like we're supposed to from marine mammal species, makes it hard. But I mean, we all see those of us that go south see all the windsurfers out there, and even just to get from down there to here, that's a long distance in a little boat. So not often that you see anyone. I do see fishing boats, and the other day I saw quite a few that pull in, and like Emma was saying, they are allowed to come in, especially off of Cove Beach.
Yeah.
And sometimes they spend the night. The other day I think they were all there because it was super windy out. So you do want to make sure that if you saw them actively fishing somehow, that they are allowed to come in and rest on there.
Yeah.
And like I said, somebody could kayak through, but it's just because of the wind and the waves and such, it's not a real ideal place for people to do that.
Yeah. And if you watch the wave activity that happens in that channel between the mainland and the island, it's not something to be messed with depending on the day. There's a lot of historical records of people just wrecking a tiny boat trying to get to the island. And Patrick goes out there pretty regularly and is very specific about when he goes between the mainland and the island for safety purposes. But at least for larger boats, it does get pretty shallow on that north end. So you'd really have to know where rocks are in that habitat to safely get your boat through there unscathed. And they're not allowed to stop off and get off the boat on the island itself.
Or the beaches, right?
Or the beaches, yeah, within our state preserve. Yeah. So Greyhound Rock, just south of us, that spans 12 square miles. And this is kind of Waddell Beach down to a little past Greyhound Rock, that big kind of oddly flat topped rock. Spanning 3 miles of our coastline, and that's getting into a little bit deeper water to 220 feet. Protecting much more of a sandy, muddy habitat compared to Año Nuevo, which is more of a rocky habitat. So it's protecting other types of habitats that our marine species use. But you'll see in a conservation area, there is certain types of fishing allowed. And we have that information on what specific activities can be done in the conservation area to share with people. So off of Greyhound Rock, which is more like the Waddell Beach area, you might see people potentially fishing from shore. You might see boats potentially fishing offshore, commercially or recreationally. Which is okay, but they have to be outside of that red border, which is very hard for all of us to know exactly that one point. I probably could give you a GPS coordinate, but like knowing where the line is out in space is hard to tell.
Is that roughly halfway up the beach? Is that what I'm seeing? Halfway up Waddell Beach?
This one,
Or is it,
I'm trying to remember.
oh, I see.
Greyhound
Basically
Rock Beach
one, right.
parking. So this actually, so Waddell Beach does not, am I remembering that correctly? Yes, so this is actually, Año Nuevo does span Waddell Beach fully. So it's the corner, if you hike from the parking lot at Waddell Beach, around that next point corner, past where the creek mouth comes out, it'll be right on the edge of that corner is where the conservation area starts and Año Nuevo State Marine Reserve ends. Sorry, I mixed those spots up in my head. And this is spanning down to Scotts Creek Beach for Greyhound Rock. So you might see people fishing. If you go to Greyhound Rock to tide pool, it's a great place for tide pooling. Highly recommend it. You might see fishermen down there. And I do have had friends that it is their job through Fish and Wildlife to monitor that stretch at Greyhound Rock for recreational fishing for sure. So, how do marine protected areas impact the wildlife here at Año Nuevo State Park? And this is kind of me getting more into how does it maybe impact or protect our elephant seals. So reducing underwater noise pollution from boats. We don't have fishermen actively utilizing this area for fishing itself. That has a lower risk of just all of that noise that comes from boat traffic. So if there are any social aspects for elephant seals, for sea lions, for other marine mammals here in the water, that's reducing at least the sound levels that they're exposed to when those weanlings are in those learning to swim phases. It's reducing human-caused disturbance via boating, so people actively pursuing animals, because that does happen. So the presence of people just here using this as a recreation area for boating, after fishing, pursuing animals. Reducing local fishing pollution. I think this could potentially be a big one. I know marine debris can move around quite a bit, but with us not having the onshore input of fishing line within our marine reserve can have a pretty profound impact on our elephant seals getting entangled in fishing line, our sea lions on the island potentially getting entangled in more fishing line, or pretty often the common species that does get entanglements around their neck or on their flippers. And just the off-gassing of diesel fuels and whatnot into our environment here specifically. But we also need to be aware that our marine environment is not, is very well connected to others, so they are still being impacted to some degree. This marine protected area supports a healthy food chain for our coastal foraging animals. So the fact that we have an island here that gives so much protected on-land habitat to seabirds, to marine mammals, it's providing a healthy food chain in those coastal waters just offshore to those seabirds that are heavily reliant on food resources. Our sea lions and harbor seals, maybe harbor seals a little bit more than sea lions, because sea lions will travel a little bit further offshore for feeding. Sea otters, for sure, having a healthy environment. They're feeding right in the place where they sleep. And then our large fish species out there. And then promoting wildlife diversity off of Año Nuevo, having a healthy ecosystem for all of these animals that are interconnected. So this is a lot, and people don't really want you to blurt out like, oh, this is everything you can and can't do, and you can take this fish, you can't take that fish. It starts to become a lot for the general public. So essentially equating a marine protected area to an underwater state or national park is something very digestible for a lot of people. They understand like, oh, it's protecting it. Oh, I can go there and enjoy that place. Because many people who visit California have been to other state or national parks. Marine protected areas are open for exploration, really emphasizing that people can go there. There are very few marine protected areas, maybe only those special closures that limit people's use of that area for fun. But reminding people, you know, if you want to go there to fish, or are interested in fishing or collecting something in that area, check those regulations out. They're easily accessible from your computer or your phone, or often there are signs wherever you go to tell you about what regulations there are for that beach or that stretch of coastline. That is a great time to tell people about Año Nuevo State Park, specifically and what you can do here. I think telling people more what you can do versus what you can't do is going to elicit a better response. And they're going to be more excited about it. Hearing a list of, oh, you can't do this, you can't do that, doesn't get people excited about going anywhere. And really emphasizing that those marine protected areas are ensuring that future generations can enjoy that healthy and productive ocean ecosystem off their coastline, in their backyard. That this is not just for keeping it looking nice, but also promoting that we have fish in the future. So that if you're really into fishing and you love eating fish, there's still fish for you in the future generations. Some fun facts. Studies have shown that there are 20% more species inside a marine reserve than outside of a marine reserve. So it really is promoting a significant amount of biodiversity in that habitat, or in that protected area. Like I said, bigger fish are better. Fish and invertebrates inside reserves can be 28% larger than ones outside of reserves. So it's really protecting those older, highly reproductive, really impactful individuals that help keep their population levels healthy. And then over 90% of California waters are open to some form of fishing and collecting. Letting people know that these marine protected areas are not trying to shut off their ability to do the things that they enjoy and love. That the majority of California is open to you recreating in so many different ways. So these are just here to help that system stay in place.
I was wondering if the increase in the species inside the reserve is because they're seeking refuge from other places where they're being disturbed as well? Or, I mean, it could also be the influence that since more science is allowed there, more things are discovered there than other places.
That's a great point. That is a great point, that people might focus more heavily on the data collection within a marine protected area than outside. A lot of research, at least here at Año Nuevo, when we got a lecture a little while ago from one of our fish biologists, they used a marine protected area reference site and a reference site outside of a marine protected area for their study. So I think that is thought about, but it is a good point that it might not be consistent across areas, that there might be a bias in the data collected within a marine protected area versus outside of one. There's always biases in science. It's good to check your facts on that for sure. Okay. So this is me throwing something out there as another opportunity for you guys and something that I'm involved in. MPA Watch is a program, and it's a community science program for us to better understand how do people use these marine protected areas. When they go to these areas, what are they doing? So volunteers collect scientific data on the coastlines, and you're collecting data on humans. You're not collecting data on the fish or the animals that are on the beach. And this is really important data for informing marine protected area management and supporting the California Department of Fish and Wildlife. So one example that I've gotten from the lead liaison between state parks and marine protected areas is when there have been oil spills, knowing how much people utilize that beach and how they utilize that beach before an oil spill, and then how much it's used after an oil spill when that environment has been dramatically changed, is really informative to our state understanding how people connect with our marine environment, how our impact in certain ways on the marine environment can then impact people's use of the marine environment in the future. So to give you a little sense of what this is like, I do about a 15-minute survey, and I'm primarily doing that at Waddell Beach right now. I'd love to get a survey started up for Cove Beach, because we have so many of you down there during breeding season, and it takes like 15 minutes tops to just walk a certain segment of the beach. Essentially what you're doing is there's designated beach segments. You walk in one direction and you record every human activity you see. Sometimes it could be literally nothing, and it's just a nice walk to get you outside. Other times, you might be recording people recreating on the beach, sitting having their lunch, playing in a tide pool. You might see people bringing dogs on the beach. That is a very often occurrence that I see at Waddell Beach. They are not allowed there. But there's nobody there to tell them not to take their dog on the beach. Here we have a little bit more regulation within the state park. But you do see it here, where people can enter the state park from outside, and they don't have to go past Pat and the kiosk. Tide pooling, fishing from shore versus fishing from a boat. So it's recording not just what you're seeing on the beach, but what you're just seeing off the beach. So that could be boats and what they're doing offshore. That could be surfers, windsurfers. Waddell Beach is an extremely popular spot for windsurfing and kite surfing. So this is a very easy way to make an impact on data collection for the state and how the state protects these areas and what potential areas are really highly valuable to the general public. For them knowing, you know, we should continue protecting this area over a long span of time because so many people come here to recreate, because so many people come here to fish from shore, those kinds of things. So if you're interested in this, and if I can get it started up here at Cove Beach, I'll let you guys know. But the walk at Waddell Beach is beautiful. If you're interested in that currently, and it's super helpful to have this data collected over time. This is something that is going on throughout multiple state park volunteer programs throughout the entire state. So we have a whole collaborative network through state parks that I meet with every month to talk about this kind of stuff and how volunteers like you guys are contributing to marine protected areas and keeping our coastline safe. Any questions?
How do we contact you, or how do you want us to let you know? Just
shoot me an email, or we can talk after class. Yeah.
all right.
Yeah.
So you started this by asking how much docents have been talking about the marine protective aspect. So do you want more emphasis on that aspect in a docent talk, or?
This is me just getting a gauge of how much we're communicating about marine protected areas. As Susan has mentioned, as has been told to you guys, you know, the guided walk season, people are not coming here to listen to you talk about everything. They really are coming here to learn about the elephant seals. So if there's an opportunity to even just tie a sentence into your talk about a marine protected area and how it's important, how it may relate to an elephant seal or a sea lion or fish, or if you know people in your group are fishermen or surfers or whatnot, tying that back to relating to them, great opportunity to do so, but I don't expect you to offload all that information on them. During roving season though, if you don't have something to talk about with somebody, bringing this up during that time is a great time to talk about it in reference to the island habitat. Or just, oh, hey, are you going to another state park today? Oh, did you know there's a marine protected area there too? Those kinds of things.
Okay.
We don't expect you to dump all this information on them, but letting them know, hey, do you know we have an underwater state park here at Año Nuevo? That's just a great way to connect it, so people start thinking about it. Yeah.
The kelp seems to be the best segue on the
Yeah.
walks that I've been on, because people see it and they're not familiar with what it is necessarily. And sometimes you'll get to see a sea otter,
Yeah.
but that seems like a good transition.
Yeah.
And it's en route too, so you can chat people up as you get to the next station.
Yeah, and we do have that marine protected area sign that you guys have probably seen out there. So there is signage out there on your walk. It is one of the stops that you guys will stop at. And you can choose to talk about it or not, depending on your group. If they're like, there's like one seal on Pole Beach and that's all they want to focus on, that is totally fine that you don't talk about the marine protected area there. But it's a great additional